On a quiet night in the forest, Emily heard a heavy knock on her cabin door. Cautious, she opened it only to freeze in shock. Standing there was a towering figure, the mother Bigfoot, weak and trembling. At her side clung a tiny baby, wide-eyed and frightened. Emily realized in that moment her life was about to change forever. Emily was 12 years old, living alone in a small wooden cabin at the edge of the northern Canadian wilderness. The cabin had belonged to her parents, but they were gone now, leaving her with little more than a roof, a stove, and the will to keep herself alive. Her days were shaped by necessity. Each morning, she chopped firewood, stacked it by the stove, and checked the traps she set for rabbits along the tree line. She boiled water from the creek, kept her food locked in crates to discourage animals, and patched the roof when snow or rain made it leak. Survival was not easy, but it had become her way of life. The forest around her was both provider and neighbor. It gave her berries in summer, small game in winter, and endless silence at night. Yet it never felt empty. The wind in the trees sounded like whispers. The creaking of branches echoed like distant voices. Sometimes, when the moon was bright, she swore she saw shadows moving where no person should be. Emily had learned not to fear it. She knew the cry of an owl, the shuffle of a bear, the long stillness of wolves circling unseen. But there were times when she paused, listening harder, certain that something else lived in those woods, something that watched quietly from the dark. She spoke to no one. The nearest town was miles away, and she rarely went. Loneliness was her constant companion, though she didn't always resent it. At night, when the fire cracked in the stove and the trees pressed close around her cabin, she accepted her life as it was. She was alone, but she was strong. That was the world Emily knew before the night everything changed. It was late evening, the fire in the stove burning low, when Emily heard a sound on the porch. At first it was only a faint scratching, like claws dragging across wood. Then came a heavy thump, strong enough to rattle the loose boards. Emily froze. She knew the sounds of animals around her cabin. Bears wandered through in spring. Moose sometimes brushed against the walls when passing. But this was different. The weight was heavier, the rhythm slower, and the scratching had a desperate edge to it. She reached for the small lantern by her bed and held her breath. Another sound followed the one that made her blood run cold. It was soft, broken, almost like a child crying. Not the cry of a fox, not the yelp of any animal she knew. This was something else. Cautiously, she stepped toward the door. Her hand shook as she gripped the handle. Every part of her wanted to stay inside, but the strange cry pressed against her chest, pulling her forward. Slowly, she unlatched the door and pushed it open. The lantern light spilled onto the porch, and Emily's breath caught in her throat. Towering above her, almost filling the frame of the doorway, stood a massive figure covered in dark, matted hair. Its shoulders slumped as if carrying unbearable weight. Its chest rose and fell with labored breaths. It was a female Bigfoot. In her arms clung a smaller shape, no bigger than a toddler. The baby's fur was thin in patches, its eyes wide and glassy with hunger. It whimpered softly, the same sound Emily had heard moments earlier. The mother Bigfoot did not move to attack. She did not snarl or lunge. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her tired eyes fixed on the girl in the doorway. Her massive hand adjusted the baby against her chest as if to shield it. For a long moment, no one moved. Emily's fear should have sent her running, but the sight before her was not one of danger. It was one of need. The creatures on her porch were not here to harm her. They were here because they had nowhere else to go. They were desperate. Emily's first instinct was to slam the door and bolt it shut. Her heart hammered, and for a brief second she imagined the creature forcing its way inside. The thought of being trapped in the cabin with such a towering figure nearly froze her in place. But then something made her pause. In the flicker of the lantern light, she noticed details she had missed at first glance. The mother Bigfoot's arms were scratched and scarred, as if torn by wire or metal. Around one wrist, deep marks showed the shape of old chains. Her fur was ragged, falling away in patches, and her movements carried the stiffness of pain. The baby clung to her chest, whimpering weakly, its tiny arms trembling as it tried to hold on. Its cry was not wild or animalistic. It was frail, almost human. Emily's fear softened into something else. She saw not a monster, but a mother barely able to stand, and a child too weak to survive without help. Then the moment that changed everything came. Slowly, the mother Bigfoot lowered herself to one knee. With great care, she shifted the baby forward and placed it gently on the porch boards, just a few feet from Emily's boots. For a heartbeat, Emily thought the creature was giving the baby to her. But then, just as quickly, the mother reached forward and pulled it back, pressing it close again. Her dark eyes lifted to meet Emily's, holding a look that was not aggression, but something closer to pleading. Emily understood. This was no threat, no warning. It was a silent request, a plea for help from a creature that had nowhere else to turn. Emily stood frozen in the doorway, the cold air cutting through her thin sweater. The Bigfoot mother did not move forward. She simply waited, the baby still tucked against her chest, its soft whimpering carrying into the night. Emily's mind raced. She had little to offer, but doing nothing felt impossible. Carefully, she stepped back inside, grabbed a half loaf of bread, 2 apples from the shelf, and a tin cup of water. Her hands shook as she returned to the porch. She set the food down on the boards, inching it forward before retreating a step. The mother Bigfoot's eyes followed every movement, wide and cautious. The baby stirred, stretching one thin arm toward the bread. For a long moment, it hesitated. Then, with trembling fingers, it reached out and snatched a piece, pulling it close and nibbling quickly, as though afraid it might be taken away. Emily didn't breathe, she simply watched. The mother let it happen. She didn't lunge, didn't pull the baby back, only kept her massive hand resting protectively near its shoulder. Her breathing was heavy but calm, as though she wanted Emily to know she meant no harm. Encouraged, Emily went inside once more. This time she brought an old wool blanket, one she had used in winter storms. Slowly, she knelt and spread it across the porch. She pushed it forward, then backed away again. The baby Bigfoot leaned toward it, eyes wide. With surprising gentleness, it grabbed the blanket and pressed it to its small face, rubbing it as if comforted by the warmth and smell. For the first time, the faint sound of a contented sigh rose from its tiny throat. Emily's fear gave way to something entirely different. Looking at the baby clutching her blanket, she felt a sudden ache of recognition. This wasn't just an animal. It was a child. Hungry, frightened, in need of care. When her eyes lifted to the mother, she found the same look staring back at her, a look of cautious trust and of hope. In that moment, the distance between them vanished. For the first time, Emily felt a bond forming, fragile, but real. The next evening, just as the sun slipped behind the trees, Emily heard the same heavy steps on the porch. When she opened the door, the mother Bigfoot was there again, the baby pressed tightly against her chest. Emily had prepared scraps, bread crusts, dried meat, a small bowl of water. She placed them at the far corner of the porch and stepped back. The baby reached eagerly, tugging at the food while the mother stood motionless, her large eyes never leaving Emily. This became their pattern. Night after night, the pair returned. Emily kept the offerings simple. A little food, a little water, sometimes the blanket folded neatly. And every night, the baby grew braver. At first it only snatched food and retreated. Soon, it lingered, watching Emily with wide, curious eyes. By the end of the week, the baby began to play. It tapped the boards with its hands, leaned forward to touch the blanket, even reached toward Emily's boots before retreating again. Each movement felt like a small bridge of trust being built. Emily found herself waiting eagerly each evening, lantern ready, scraps set aside. But the mother Bigfoot was changing. She no longer stood tall as she had that first night. Her movements slowed. When she shifted her weight, Emily noticed a limp in her left leg, each step heavier than the last. Her chest heaved with effort, her shoulders sagged. The baby thrived on the scraps Emily offered, but the mother seemed to weaken with every passing night. Her fur grew dull, her eyes sunken with fatigue. She no longer reached forward or adjusted the baby with strength. Instead, she stood in silence, letting her child eat, her gaze fixed on Emily with something between sorrow and trust. Emily watched carefully, her heart tightening. She was too young to fix wounds, too unprepared to save something so large and wild. But she understood what her eyes told her. The mother was fading, and though she never spoke, Emily sensed what was coming. Something tragic waited just ahead. The snowstorm came suddenly. Wind howled through the trees, and the cabin walls creaked under the weight of drifting snow. Emily sat by the stove, wrapped in her blanket, listening to the storm swallow the night. She did not expect visitors in weather so cruel. Then came the sound, slow, dragging steps on the porch. Heavy, uneven, each footfall buried in snow. Emily's breath caught. She rose, lantern in hand, and opened the door to the freezing wind. There she was. The mother Bigfoot stood hunched, her fur soaked with snow, her shoulders trembling. The baby clung weakly to her chest, whimpering against the cold. The sight froze Emily in place, but the creature did not threaten. Instead, she moved closer with great effort, every step a struggle. Emily watched in silence as the massive figure lowered herself onto one knee. For the first time, she extended her arms, not in defense, but in surrender. Slowly, carefully, she placed the baby in Emily's arms. Emily held her breath. The child was warm but frail, its tiny hands clutching at her coat. She looked up, confused and afraid, but the mother's eyes told her everything. This was not a gift. This was a goodbye. The great creature's dark eyes locked with Emily's. They held no anger, no fear, only resignation. A silent understanding passed between them. The mother could no longer survive, but she trusted Emily to keep the little one safe. Snow swirled between them as the Bigfoot rose unsteadily to her feet. She gave one final glance, a long, lingering look that burned into Emily's memory. Then, without sound, she turned and walked into the storm. Her massive shape faded quickly into the white, swallowed by wind and snow. Emily cried out, but there was no answer. The night closed around her. She looked down at the baby in her arms. Its wide eyes searched her face, still clutching the blanket she had given days earlier. Emily pressed it close, her heart breaking with the weight of what had just happened. She was alone again, but now she carried a life that depended on her. The weeks that followed changed everything for Emily. The baby Bigfoot became part of her small world inside the cabin. She fed it warm milk from a tin cup, mashed berries gathered from the frozen edges of the woods, and broth she made from scraps. The little one ate eagerly, its strength returning day by day. At first, it stayed close to the blanket she had given, curling into it for comfort. But soon it began to explore. It toddled after her on unsteady legs, reaching for her hands, mimicking her movements as she worked. When she swept the floor, it dragged a stick across the boards. When she stacked firewood, it picked up small pieces and placed them beside hers. At night, when the storm winds rattled the roof, the baby made soft, cooing sounds, almost like humming. Emily often found herself listening, comforted by the strange, gentle noises. For the first time since her parents had gone, she no longer felt entirely alone. The bond deepened quickly. When Emily stepped outside, the baby pressed against the door until she returned. When she sat by the stove, it climbed onto her lap, heavy but warm, resting its head against her shoulder. In those moments, Emily felt something she thought she had lost forever: a family. But as the days stretched into weeks, a quiet truth lingered in her mind. The baby did not belong in the cabin. Its hands, its voice, its wild eyes, everything about it was tied to the forest. Emily cared for it with all she had, but deep down, she knew she was only keeping it safe until the time came to let go. By the time spring arrived, Emily knew she could not keep the baby. The small creature had grown stronger, faster, and louder. Its calls carried into the forest, and she feared others might hear. Tracks in the snow had already drawn attention. Rangers came through the area asking questions. Hunters were seen moving along the ridges, following signs they did not understand. Emily realized the baby's safety and her own was at risk. The decision cut deep, but she knew it was the only choice. One cool morning, with cedar branches dripping from recent rain, she wrapped the baby in a thick blanket and carried it into the forest. Her steps were heavy. The baby clung to her coat, making soft sounds, unaware of what was about to happen. She reached a quiet grove where moss covered the ground and the trees stood like guardians. Emily knelt and set the baby down gently. Her hands lingered on its shoulders. "I love you," she whispered. "You'll always have me." Her voice cracked, but she held steady, knowing this moment would stay with her forever. Before she could turn away, movement stirred at the edge of the grove. From the shadows, the mother appeared. She was thinner, her fur tangled, her breath weak but alive. Slowly, she came forward, her dark eyes fixed on Emily. No words were spoken, but the meaning was clear. The baby cried out and reached for its mother. The great creature gathered it up carefully, pressing it against her chest. For a long moment, she looked at Emily. It was not anger, nor fear, only recognition. Then, without sound, the mother faded into the trees, carrying her child home. Emily stood alone, her heart heavy, but her choice made. Years passed, and Emily grew into a woman. She still lived in the same small cabin on the edge of the forest. Life moved forward, yet some memories never left her. The days of raising that helpless baby Bigfoot remained sharper than anything else in her mind. She never told a soul. The memory was hers alone, too fragile and too unbelievable to share. At dusk, when the sky faded into deep blue, she often sat on her porch. The forest always felt alive with whispers, but sometimes it was more than that. She would catch a shadow standing near the tree line, tall, still, and watchful. It never came closer, never made a sound, but its presence was undeniable. Emily never felt fear, only a deep ache of recognition. She knew in her heart it was the same baby she had cared for so long ago, no longer helpless but strong and grown. It returned not out of need, but out of loyalty. A silent guardian in the woods. The memory of those months together never faded, and each shadow at the edge of the trees reminded Emily that love, once given, is never forgotten.